My Bible is open to Proverbs chapter 10. We're going to look at one verse there here in just a moment. Then we're going to be flipping all through Proverbs together this evening as we get into a discussion out of this wisdom writing. Proverbs 10, we will be in verse 18 here in just one moment. Good to see everyone out this evening. It is always a wonderful thing when we can be together to worship our God, to get into His Word with one another. As I have, for the most part, last Sunday night being an exception, been trying to preach from the previous week's reading. We're going to be doing a little bit of that this evening. But as we jump around Proverbs here, picking up the subject on the usage of our tongues, we'll be in a little bit of this past week's reading, a little bit before even that. But on the whole, as we move around the book of Proverbs here, we'll be looking at some Proverbs that we have looked at, we have read, if we're keeping up with the Old Testament weekly reading here. And as we pick up some of this wisdom, pick up some of this, building that knowledge base that would begin with the fear of the Lord, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, that would guide how we speak and the way that we use our tongues. And so as we get into this, the proverb writer here addresses several improper uses of our tongues, and we want to hone in on that here in the beginning, where we'll think about the tongue that would lie, the lying tongue. Let's look in Proverbs 10 and verse 18. The one who conceals hatred has lying lips, and whoever utters slander is a fool. As we step into this verse, we really need to talk about what it is we're talking about. What is it that the author is putting forth here as he says that the one who conceals hatred, that one has a lying tongue? Well, the key to understanding the first clause is to bring the second into the picture, where he starts talking about the slandering that occurs, where once more, and whoever utters slander is a fool. And so as we pair these two thoughts together, what we need to see the author saying here, the one who is concealing hatred, what he is doing is, when he sees your face, well, he's going to say every nice word that can be said. And boy, he's going to talk so nice and so kind to you. While inside the whole time, he's thinking, I absolutely just cannot stand this person. And every word coming out of their mouths towards you is concealing their hatred, and it's lying lips. It's a lying tongue as they spew these niceties. And then they go behind your back, and what do? They utter slander. Instead of all of those nice words that they were saying to your face, now they're spewing slander. So as we step into this verse and talk about an unwise use of the tongue, talk about an improper use of the tongue, here is a lying tongue that it's double. This double-tongued person who would say one thing to your face and another behind your back. And he says, that's not a wise use. That's not a proper use of the tongue that our God has given us. And we need to take that to our hearts, that would not describe us, that would not be us. Very often, we're very quick to recognize, man, you tell an outright lie, and that's bad, that's wrong, I don't do that. But this double-tonguedness, it brings that in a slighter way. It kind of sneaks it in through the back doors. I'm not not really lying, except the scriptures say that's what it is. It says that concealment of hatred, it's being done through lying lips. It's being done through lips that are concealing this hatred as niceties are spoken to one's face and very different words are spoken behind their back. The scripture calls that lying lips. It refers to those words spoken behind the back as slander, and to act in that way is foolish. Let's move on to chapter 12 and look in verse 22 here as we move further into this concept of the lying tongue. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight. As we step into very strong terminology, that if you have lying lips, that is an abomination to the Lord. That is a thing that the Lord absolutely hates. And it's a sign of unfaithfulness. I know that, and I've shared with you a number of times in our Minor Prophets study, I know those of you with the New King James, it does not use the word faithfulness here. It uses the word truthfulness. And I try to emphasize how closely related those two concepts are, where if one is going to be truthful, that is to be faithful to your word, that is to uphold the speech that you have given. That is why, because God is faithful, that he cannot lie, because he holds true to his word absolutely. And so what I want to bring out in this, as far as lying being an abomination to God, where we recognize this act of unfaithfulness, this act of not holding true to our word, God looks at that and God says, I hate that. You think about Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, as he is condemning the act of the Jews who think they have a system worked out where they can use the right phrasing, they can use the right statement, and it's okay if they're lying. It's okay if they are uttering this oath and they're not telling the truth because they're not swearing by anything that is important. Go over into Matthew 23, and there are some things Jesus lists for them there that they in their own mind say, now if I swear by these other things, that's important and I have to keep my word. And Jesus' teaching for them in the Sermon on the Mount is, look, you can't use any trickery to get out of the keeping of your word. Your yes needs to mean yes. Your no needs to mean no. These words have a meaning and you use them properly. And if you don't, that is an act of unfaithfulness. That is an act of not holding true to your word. That is an act of lying that this wise writer says is an abomination to our God. What we see in this is that those who would follow God, those who would speak as God would have them to speak, need to be true to their word. As we say we're going to do something, we need to do it. As we say we're not going to do something, we need to not do that thing and hold faithful, hold truthful to the word that we have put forward. That's not to speak of moments where sometimes we say we're going to do something and something does come up. Yes, sometimes life happens. But it does certainly speak to, I'm going to do this thing and I have no intention of doing that thing. This is what I'm going to give myself over to. And no, not really. That's an act of unfaithfulness. That's an act of, I'm not going to hold myself true to my word. And that lying, that is an abomination to our God. To look at a second category of the improper use of our tongue, we want to think about the whispering or the gossiping tongue. Both of these concepts are the same ideal, though different wording is being used there. Let's look in chapter 16 and verse 28. A dishonest man spreads strife, and a whisperer separates close friends. Let's just point out that the wise writer puts a connection between the dishonest man and the whisperer there, that here he is pairing the two of them together, although the whisperer is not necessarily uttering dishonest things. They are in a collection, they are in a category of peoples together here. But what I want us to pick up in what the whisperer does here, where he can separate the closest of friends. You ever meet a couple of people, you look at them and you, man, I don't think there is anything in the world that would ever tear them apart. They are the bestest of the bestest friends, and boy, I can't see anything ever coming between them. And the wise writer says, someone comes along whispering. Someone comes along gossiping. And that's sure enough to begin driving the wedge between these two that you thought would never be driven. What I want us to see, the point we need to walk away with in the wisdom here is, when we talk about whispering, when we talk about gossiping, that does greater damage than we could ever imagine. James has been called the Proverbs of the New Testament. And in this, I am very mindful of what he has to say in chapter 3 and verse 5, where he's talking about the destructive power of the tongue. And he says, so also is the tongue a small member, as he compares it to the rudder of a ship. Yet it boasts of great things. How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. It says, here's the tongue. And it's this tiny thing, doesn't seem like it amounts to much. But it doesn't take but a little bitty flame to set a whole forest on fire. And it does far greater damage than we could ever imagine. It is fuel for the fire of quarreling, of fighting, of argumentation. Let's go to chapter 26 and look at verse 20 here. Proverbs 26 and verse 20. For lack of wood, the fire goes out, and where there is no whisperer, quarreling ceases. Just like you have a fire, you take the wood out of it, and the fire will go out. It says, you have all the quarreling and the fighting. You take the whispering out. You take the gossiping out, he says. It ceases as well. The fuel has been removed from the fire, because instead of there being so much whispering and gossiping behind each other's backs, the problem gets dealt with. You want to whisper, want to gossip, that is fuel for quarreling, fuel for the fire, as well as this gossiping, this whispering, being a betrayal of confidence. Let's look in 20 and verse 19 here. Proverbs 20 and verse 19. Whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets. Therefore, do not associate with a simple babbler. As far as, one-to-one translation, I do not know that it is precise in translation, but truly I do appreciate the Holman Christian Standard Bible in this verse where it reads, "The one who reveals secrets is a constant gossip. Avoid someone with a big mouth," is the way it reads, where it's bringing out here that you have a confidant. You have one that you would take to yourself in confidence, that you would bring yourself to them. You're making yourself known to them, opening yourself up to them. And they go forth and they betray that confidence. They go forth and they are gossiping about these things behind your back, that these things are being made known. And so in this gossiping, there is a betrayal of this confidence that would be had. What would be a moment of growing closer together now is this moment of a fire being fueled, quarrels breaking out. And that little member that James talks about, that tiny little bit of fire, and a whole forest is set ablaze. Now, here's something that is remarkably interesting as we step into the wisdom literature on the gossiping tongue. Yes, the wise writer has plenty to say about the usage of the tongue. Let's take this just a little bit further, where it's not merely the misuse of the tongue, but of the ear that would give way to that tongue that says, "Give me more, give me all of those secrets." Let's head to chapter 18 and verse 8. Proverbs 18 and verse 8, "The words of a whisperer are like delicious morsels. They go down into the inner parts of the body." He's going to repeat that in 26 and verse 22. He has the same thing to say again. Anyone ever felt that before? Someone is telling you those juicy secrets. Maybe the young people would say today they're spilling the tea. I'm not sure if I'm young enough to use that young people phrase or not anymore. But anyway, you've been on the other side of that. Excuse me. And there's this reaction. There's this, "Man, this is juicy. Man, I just want to hear more of this." There's a reason he calls it a delicious morsel. You ever been eating the best food you've ever had in your life, and you don't want to put the fork down? You don't want to stop eating? That's what he says in these secrets. You're there and you just want to hear more and more and more. And he warns, that's not wise at all. It is not just a matter of they are saying things that they ought not be saying. It's also a matter of you're listening to things that you ought not be listening to. Let's look in 17 and verse 4 here. Proverbs 17 and verse 4. "An evildoer listens to wicked lips, and a liar gives ear to mischievous tongue." An evildoer gives ear to wicked lips. I think we have established in these first several verses, chapter 16 and verse 28, chapter 26 and verse 20, chapter 20 and verse 19, to gossip, To be a whisperer, that is wicked lips. That is lips that speak against what God is, lips that act in a way that they shouldn't. And the one who gives ear to them, the one who listens to them. The wise writer says, that's an evildoer. Do we ever put that strong of a wording on that says, I'm partaking in wickedness? Sometimes what we'd like to do is, I tell you what, I'm thoroughly enjoying myself, and you're the one who's wrong. So if you want to be in wrongness, you go ahead and be in wrongness. And I'm just going to listen and enjoy myself because I've got this little degree of separation. I'm not the one participating in it. 17 and verse 4 has something to say about that. An evildoer gives ear to wicked lips. We become a participator in that. Someone's gossiping. Someone's whispering. Our place is, I don't need to hear that. And you don't need to say it. I don't care how delicious the morsel is. I'm not going to eat that food. That's not going to be descriptive of my life. So these two uses of the tongue laid down, these two misuses of the tongue laid down. Let's think about some of the proper use of our tongues. Let's head back to chapter 10 here. Chapter 10 and verse 19. When words are many, transgression is not lacking, but whoever restrains his lips is prudent or wise. We would restrain our lips. He says there is a wisdom to that as you put forth more and more and more speech, stepping into using speech that is not wise to use. No, speak less. Don't use many words and step into transgression. But if you can restrain your lips, you hold back the usage of your lips, there is wisdom to that. We need to head over to chapter 21 and pick up verse 23 here. Proverbs 21 and verse 23. Whoever keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble. In that first keeps there, I appreciate the word guards. Whoever guards his mouth and his tongue keeps himself out of trouble. That we would hold back. We would place our mouths and our tongues into a pen, like an animal pen, an animal keep, so that its usage will be guarded. Anyone bring to mind once more the words of James in James 1 and verse 19. Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, that there would be a slowness to speech, where we're going to keep our mouths guarded to ensure that the words that come out of our mouth are not going to be an inappropriate use of our tongue. Building into our next point, the proper use of the tongue is going to be a tongue that will listen before it begins speaking. Have you ever, and maybe I'm going to betray my guiltiness in this matter, but have you ever been in a conversation with someone and while they are talking, you are thinking about what you are going to say next? You're thinking about how to respond to them before they have even finished talking. And I tell you what, that can get us in trouble sometimes. That can make words come out of our mouths that ought not come out of our mouths. We need tongues that will listen before we speak. Once more, in reference to the James passage, be quick to hear. Let's think about chapter 18 here in Proverbs, and we'll pick up verse 13 before jumping down to verse 17. Proverbs 18 and verse 13, if one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame. Says that's foolishness. That's folly to start answering, to start speaking before you hear the entire situation out. You have to listen to what is being said, pay attention to what is being said before answer can be given. Now, we may find ourselves in a situation that, okay, Colton said, fully listen to what they say and then give answer. And we're hearing one half of a story. That here someone has come seeking counsel and they've laid out the entire situation for you, and you're hearing what they have to say about the matter, and we don't actually fully listen to the whole thing before speaking on it. Jump down to verse 17 with me. The one who states his case first seems right, until the other comes and examines him. Ready to jump in, and we're ready to speak to a situation. We're ready to jump in and talk about what's going on here. And the wise writer says, sometimes the other person has something to say too. Sometimes this gets brought into the picture. The first one seemed right because he got to present the story in his way and it sounded good until the other person came in. We need to listen. We need to listen to the whole story. We need a mouth that's willing to speak less, not so quick to jump in and say these things, that would fully listen before speaking, but then speaking less, fully listening, moving into thinking before we speak. Coming to chapter 29 and verse 20 here. Proverbs 29:20. Do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than for him. I wish I could make a Lord of the Rings reference here, but I do not know that that would mean anything to anyone. And so, all right, I see a head nod. That would mean you are familiar with the Ents then. And so, with that says, you see a man who is hasty in his words, it's foolishness. It's not going to bring about wisdom in any way. What do? You got to think before you speak. Don't just jump into talking here. I've already said some things this evening where I said, I'm going to betray some of my own guiltiness here. So certainly this has been a lesson for me multiple times inside of my life, and praise God that he's brought me as far as he had. Boy, he's cut as much away from me that needs to be cut away as he has, and as he continues to do his work. Praise him for where he's brought me. But isn't that a lesson for each and every one of us? There. I don't just need to open my mouth and let fall out what falls out. There needs to be some thinking that occurs. There needs to be some thought put into the words that we are giving here. So as we think about a tongue that is speaking less, It is listening before it speaks. And it's putting thought into what is to be said now. What are some proper words for our tongues? Let's go to chapter 16. Proverbs 16, and let's pick up verse 23 here. The heart of the wise makes his speech judicious and adds persuasiveness to his lips. Now, we could make a point here that the words we need to use need to be judicious and persuasive, and certainly that is true. But what I want us to bring out of this point, it is the wise word. Because it is wise speech that is judicious. It is wise speech that adds persuasiveness. And as we work on that, we want wise words to come out. What I want you to see the author says this comes from is the heart of the wise. How are we going to speak wise words? Well, we have to have a wise heart. Where is that going to come from? Well, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, didn't we? When we opened up the Proverbs talking about how Solomon has written these things down so that we can learn knowledge and learn wisdom and be prudent so that we can become wise and have wisdom. And the very starting place for the building ground of this knowledge and way of thinking is the fear of the Lord. For us to have this wisdom, for us to be able to speak wise words, that starts with the fear of the Lord. And as we are shaped by Him, as we do become the people that He has called us to be, what grows out of that? Well, from the heart of the wise come wise words that will be judicious, that will be persuasive as we speak according to the will of our God. We need to speak fitting, timely words. Let's get into chapter 15 and verse 23 here. To make an apt answer is a joy to a man, and a word in season, how good is it? There's a right time to say the words. I am mindful of Esther in this. You remember when she is fearful to go before the king, and Mordecai encourages her, and so she does go before the king. And the king, I'm going to really heavily paraphrase this, the king says, "What do you want?" And Esther's reply isn't, "Haman is trying to kill all of us. Look, you really need to take care of this issue. I'm trying to save the Jews." Her reply is, "I want to hold a feast for the king." It wasn't the right time to lay everything out. It wasn't the right time to make her entire heart known. There was a right season for her to lay out the right words. Pick up chapter 25 and verse 11 with me. Chapter 25 and verse 11, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver. So we have the right time, the right season to say a word fitly spoken. The right words in the right time. That is something that takes wisdom. That is something that takes the experience of having been shaped by our God. But that's words that must come out of our mouth. Words that are fitting for the time that they are spoken. One of the things that I want us to see in this really helps us to see the importance of us developing relationships with one another. That we would have a closeness with each other, because as we develop in these relationships that we have with each other, you may become the right person. The person that I'm not in that relationship with someone else, that you then being the right person will have the right time to say the right words. These are proper words for our tongues. These are good words for our tongues to speak, to say these things in wisdom. Moving forward here, we talk about proper speech being pleasant words that would bring healing. Going back to chapter 15 here. Proverbs 15 and verse 4. A gentle or healing tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. To have a perverse tongue, to have perverseness within the tongue, that brings strife, that brings the quarreling we talked about earlier, that breaks the spirit. But the healing tongue, it brings life. We want to speak words, to say things that would bring healing. Chapter 16 and verse 24. Gracious words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. To speak gracious words, to speak sweet words that would bring healing in times of brokenness. Do you remember Job's friends? And they come to him and they say all the stuff that they say to Job. And Job said, miserable comforters are you all. Where is the pleasant words that would bring healing in this time? We're seeing that concept brought out here, words that would bring healing. Let's pick up chapter 18 and verse 21, where we see the two areas our words can bring out. Chapter 18 and verse 21. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruits. It says death is in the power of the tongue, and life is in the power of the tongue. How will we use our words? Will we use them unto death? Or will we use them unto life? And that's really the last part of the verse. Those who love it, those who love the use of it, will eat of its fruits. That here, however we use it, that's the fruit that's going to be brought out of our usage of our tongues. And so, we need to speak healing, pleasant words. Now, I make that point and someone says, so no condemnation ever. No correction ever. Is that what we are bringing out here? We just kind of leave that off the list of proper words for our tongue. That's not the case. That cannot be the case. There's plenty of passages outside of outside of Proverbs that would help prove that for us, but we're just going to stay inside of Proverbs to see that reproving words, corrective words are appropriate for our tongues as well. Chapter 25 and verse 12 here. Proverbs 25 and verse 12, like a gold ring or an ornament of gold is a wise reprover to a listening ear. I want you to listen carefully. to that last phrase, a wise reprover to a listening ear. He says these two things are necessary to make it this ornamentation. These two things are necessary for it to be this thing of preciousness. It is wise words. You remember we opened up with that point, those wise words that are judicious, those wise words that are persuasive. It's not, I'm going to jump in and I'm just going to bite your head off because, boy, there's some correction that needs to be had here. Is there a place for words of strong correction? Absolutely. You cannot read Matthew 23 and walk away with a conclusion otherwise. For those that should have known, and Jesus makes strong correction and condemnation of the Pharisees who were acting hypocritically. But here, as we come to talking about our approaching one another, our coming to this one that we have relationship, how do you offer words of correction, reproving words? He says, you do it wisely. Thinking about Paul in Ephesians, speaking the truth in love, you do it wisely. But do you see the second thing that's necessary for it to be a precious thing, for it to be this ornamentation? A listening ear. Words can be spoken as wisely as wisdom allows. But you need an ear that would listen to reproof. An ear that would listen to correction. And the wise writer says with both of these elements, words wisely spoken to an ear that will listen, it becomes this precious thing. And finally, we need to come to chapter 28 and verse 23. Whoever rebukes a man will afterward find more favor than he who flatters with his tongue. You ever meet, I guess our society has a word for yes man, where everything you say to them, they're going to yes. That's the best idea we've ever heard. You're the smartest person we have ever met. You are the greatest person ever. That's those that flatter with their words. And what the wise writer brings out here is that afterwards, and boy, that's such an important word because it sure doesn't happen right in the moment, where someone who has been surrounded by a flatterer comes to someone who is not a flatterer that says, look, that's really not a very good idea. There's really not a whole lot of wisdom in doing that. I really think we need to steer into a different course here. And he says, words that would offer this correction, words that would offer steering to this different course, words that would rebuke afterward. Not right in that moment. Let me reemphasize that again. Afterward, that you would find more favor. I've listened to a podcast here recently of someone who has been surrounded by flatterers for much of his career. And as he is seeking some other career opportunities and he's going on these various podcasts, he makes the point, look, I know I'm coming to you and you're against me. I know you are not a fan of my ideals. And I am doing that with great intention because I don't want someone to emptily hype me up. I don't want someone to be my yes man. I want someone who is going to push back against me. To make this recognition that I tell you what, I think I've used that phrase too many times this evening. I'll try to refrain from any more usage of it. It feels so good to be surrounded by those who would just yes you all the way. But yesing you all the way doesn't give you what you need. Doesn't give you the wisdom, doesn't give you the corrective words that you need. And them no's hurt right in that moment. But afterward, you come out stronger. Afterward, there is more favor to be had to learn. Reproving words are proper words for our tongues. As we bring this to a close then this evening, as we talk about or have talked about the usage of our tongues and our mouths being given over to our God's way, let's stretch that out. Not talking about our mouths, but our lives. Are you given over to God's way? Are you living as our God would have you to live, properly giving yourself over to Him? Or are you living as you would live, unwisely in the way of the world? If so, won't you repent? Turn away from looking like this world. Turn toward our God. If there is anything at all this evening we can do to help you, won't you come while we stand and sing the song selected? The